Hey everybody, it's Craig Becta, and I'm joined today with Dan Tramble from Dr. Dan Amps. And in this episode, he's going to reveal the secret to why some amps sound better than others. So that's going to be pretty exciting. I'm just excited to have you here, Dan. I didn't even know that you lived like so close to me. And then I found out and I was like, wow, this guy makes like awesome amps and he lives really close. I got to talk to him.
Yeah, I've been doing this for quite some time, and over the years, when you build and you do projects for people, you develop a relationship with them. Know all my customers, and anyway, they always either associate the area that we are from either hockey with Sidney Crosby and Nathan McKinnon. I mean, there's not too many people in the world that actually know familiar with Nova Scotia. It's a different place, but the one thing, doing this kind of work like around the world, you can do it very remotely. So you can do it from Nova Scotia, you can do it from Cole Harbour, you can do it from any part of Canada or any part of the world. It's because because of the internet.
And then when I heard some of your amps too, that's the thing. Like once I was like, well, who is this guy? And then I started seeing some sound clips and I was like, oh. And then you're like, oh. And then you're like, oh, other people play. Oh, and then I guess a guy from 3 Days Grace has one of your amps. Guitar player from Bryan Adams has one of your amps. You make a number of different amps. How many different models do you make?
Right now, I'll kind of try a watered down version from the start because it all adds up to it. Mm-hmm. But my amplifiers are a work in progress. And in the beginning, what happened was I started building more like Marshall variants and Marshall clones. Some of the sounds that really attracted me as a young person were... I loved AC/DC, and I loved Judas Priest, and I loved bands like Kiss. And the one thing that they all had in common, they all used an old Marshall 4-hole amp. And I started building them, and then I built so many that what happened is as I progressed with my evolution of the circuit, I started to change and tweak and flip and do different things and adjust things like feedback loops in the amp, and I'd voice them for different sounds and things like this. And I really got into it. And anyway, so my natural progression with building these amps, I started to build my own versions of them. And it would probably took me about 7 years to get there. But now, like all my amps that I build, I all have something local with the name of them. So it's kind of strange, but that's just my spin on things. But right now, I have my own versions of amps, and they're versions of existing amplifiers. But what I do is I take them, I modify them. I can either improve them for safety compared to some of the original versions, because some of the original, Fender and Marshall amplifiers in today's standards would be considered unsafe. But I change things like that for safety. And then what I really start to do is, because I've been fortunate enough to work with a bunch of different serious professional and amateur musicians, they all want different things. And the thing is you be able to come in and start to work on honing a sound and really working on trying to get into the frequency of the amplifier and the dynamic response. That's what it's all about. But to answer your question, I have 5 models right now. I have the Woodside, I have the Creighton Park, I have the M68, I have the Portland Reverb amplifier, and I have the Brightwood. But next year, I have a couple different amplifiers that I'm going to try and throw into the mix as well. And basically, what these amplifiers are is they're basically like a Creighton Park is. It's kind of like a 2204, but it's kind of not. A Woodside is definitely like a Marshall style 2203, 2204 amp. So what I did with that was I took the best ideas and the best mods that I ever heard, and I thought of like one genre of music or one artist, and then I kind of went with it. And when I built the amp, I went in a tangent for a couple weeks, and I tweaked that amp until I got it to the sound that I wanted to get it at. It's a process that you have to go through. It can be very time consuming, and sometimes it can come to you very quick.
So you've had some interesting relationships that you developed with other amp builders. And I know there's there's all these stories about the amp that Slash used on the first Guns N' Roses album, and that he had rented it. I think it was from SIR.
Absolutely.
It was a rental studio, and there was a guy that worked there, Frank Levi, that modded those amps. And then 100%. They had certain numbers like number 34, number 39, and apparently these amps sounded better than anything else out there.
Right.
So tell us more about what you found out about these amps and how you kind of maybe use that knowledge in some of your stuff.
Well, so what happens is like generally with, and I mean, I'm sorry to cross-reference myself so much, but I'm personally speaking, you get into something, and then what ends up happening is you just want to go all out because when you're really interested in something and you're really passionate in something, there's no sense going half-assed. You need to go the whole way, and I've been pretty fortunate and pretty lucky to meet some pretty cool cats along the way, including Frank Levi. I never met him face to face, but we had quite an online friendship. We used to talk a lot about amplifiers because it's the one thing at the end of his life that really brought him absolute peace and happiness. He used to tell me the stories about the amplifiers that he did at SIR, and like the 34. And basically what happened was um, from what I take of it, Frank worked there, and they had several. It was a backline rental company, and what happened was he took a couple of these amplifiers, and they just decided to take them apart and tweak them and change capacitors and change resistors so that they voiced these amplifiers and brought them into something that they originally were not meant to be. And it's it's pretty cool because the thing is it's with the guys that I've met over the time doing this kind of stuff. It's to hear some of these stories and just have like what I call a shop talk. So it's basically what it is. So you talk about this. Oh yeah, I had this amplifier. I really found I got this kind of sound out of it and that kind of sound out of it, and that's what amp builders do with one another. It's how they communicate. And anyway, it's really cool because the thing is you talk about the effect of this coupling capacitor on the circuit, or this cathode stage, or setting up an additional gain stage via diodes, or a preamp tube or whatnot. And it's when you get to have pretty in-depth conversations with guys about this kind of stuff, like it goes for a really long time, and all of a sudden it's just like a dam that opens up, and then all of a sudden, oh my goodness, there's a whole new realm. And what I've learned from conversations with these people, you're constantly always learning. It never stops. It just continues to keep going and going, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I found it really interesting because that's what I alluded to earlier is why do some amps sound better? Because then everybody's always saying, well, oh, I heard this one, JCM 800 that sounded great. And then there's like, oh, there's these mods. And, then it can get kind of confusing if you're sort of looking for something different than what's already out there. And so what do you think is the secret to, I guess it's a broad question now that you just answered that question.
Well, yeah, it's
not,
a very
that simple.
No, not at all. It's a very in-depth point of conversation, and you could go on for a really long time. But basically, I'll say this one thing. I've noticed it from servicing older vintage Marshall amplifiers. I predominantly refer to them because I've worked a lot on those amps, and they are pretty much the quintessential sound for me as a teenager and what I perceived as awesome guitar tone and wicked rock and roll. Anyway, getting back to my story, when you go back and you look at the early like JMP amps and the early Plexi amps, and the parts that were used back then, they were built to complete different tolerances than what they're built to today. And I'll give you an example. Like nowadays, today, a lot of stuff is 5% tolerance. So your resistors in your amplifier are 5% tolerance. Your tolerances on your power transformer, about 5%. Like everything is so precise. And back then, back in the day when they were building these amplifiers, and I'm lucky to know this because the thing is I'm friends with one of the original founding members of Marshall Amplification back in the early day that used to work in the back shop. And anyway, and we've spoke for hours and hours and hours through the online about why different amps sound so different. But basically, the reason why is is back then when they built these amplifiers, the components that they used, they were built to a complete different tolerance. Everything, it was not nearly as precise as it is today. And, you know, that opens up the whole window for, older amps being more round and organic, and newer amps being more modern and sterile. And some people think that the older amps sound more organic because everything was built so loose back then and it was just so free. And today, everything is very stringent, and it's built with the most zero tolerance parts you can get. But anyways, I'll get to that in a few minutes. So basically, going back with these old amps, the thing is they were very very loose in their tolerances and things like that, and it continued the whole way through, even with the JCM 800 series. Now, I've been lucky to work with quite a few different guitar techs, and I've heard many stories over the years, but one that comes to my mind is okay. Everybody knows Zakk Wylde, Black Label
Sure,
Society.
yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, he's got iconic sound. So anyway, the thing is when they came out with his 2203 signature amplifier, basically what happened is these guys collect so many different amplifiers because they'll play Halifax one night and then they'll play Toronto the next, and then they'll play New York or Nashville or whatnot. That's how touring life goes. But generally, what happens when you have a day or two off in these stops, if you're a guitar tech for like a really big band, what they do is generally they send you out on a hunt, and you'll either look for a guitar or you look for amps, anything like that, because these guys, that's how they pick up their gear. So it's completely normal for guys to have several amplifiers. I know that for instance, Angus Young, he has close to, I think, 500 or 600 in his personal
Wow, that's a
collection.
crazy
Yeah,
amount.
it's crazy. So, anyways, getting back to my story. So, what happened with Zakk is he had the ultimate 800 that just gave him the absolute best sound of best sounds, and it was perfect. And so, what happened is they sent that 800 back to Marshall over in Milton Keynes, and then what they did is they proceeded to take the amplifier apart. And then what they did is they put the schematic up here, and then they looked at the real amplifier on the bench, and then they metered and measured every part. Because what happens with these pieces and these amplifiers, like over time, stuff will drift. And, it's just like tires on your car. There's a expected timeline for how long this is going to last. Like, what's our expected life expectancy of this one component? But what I'm trying to say is pieces will drift in these amplifiers due to voltage. And what happens is the best amp that he came across that absolutely sounded perfect. And it's a personal joke from what I was told, was they got a chuckle over there. They were like, oh yeah, we built so many of those amplifiers and we built them with so many different variables. We're absolutely completely mystified that this amplifier that he loved so much was so close to the original schematic, exactly what it was intended to be. Because I mean, a lot of amp techs that say watch the show, or people that are passionate about amp circuits, they'll know that what happens is when you start to see some of this older stuff come in. Say for instance, if a cathode stage uses a 2.7K resistor, and then the assembler looks in the bench that day and they go, geez, guess what? We don't have 2.7s that day, so we're probably going to go down to a 2.2. We'll substitute whatever is in our window to get us into the rough area of where we're supposed to be. And I've seen it with
Yeah, that's
older
weird.
amps.
You would never think that. You would think they're all going to sound the same, and you wouldn't think some guy at the factory's like, oh, we're low on parts today, we're just going to use this. So
Yeah,
that brings me around to thinking why it's a good idea to get someone like yourself to build an amp, because you're going to build it,
yeah,
the best possible way versus, say,
right,
a mass production type of amp.
right,
So
yeah.
let's talk about where people can find out more about you. Like, if they see this video, where do they go?
Well, I started off originally with my Facebook page, and that's what I went with for years. So I'm on Facebook. It's Dr. Dan Amplifier Services. You should see it if you do a search on it. And I also have an Instagram page as well for Dr. Dan Amps. And I just started a website probably about 4 years ago. You can go there as well. I will warn though, the website is a complete work in progress. Generally, with everything, I take it all on myself. I have a friend of mine that's helped me out with my website, but we're slowly getting there. Anyways, yeah, there's a couple different ways that you can contact me. You can either send me a message through Facebook, through Instagram, or you can go right to the website.
It's a 68 12,000. So is that like an early EVH type sound, or?
100% it is. That's exactly what it is. Aficionados that know those amplifiers and play those amplifiers, they know that they're very dynamic amplifier. They're extremely percussive. They just have a complete different sound and feel to them. A lot of it has to do with the orientation of the transformers is one thing. That's one myth in those amplifiers. And the other thing is that amplifier was built in a complete transitional time for Marshall. So what happened is they were going from the midways like JTM bass style amplifiers, and they were flipping them over to the super leads. And when they flipped over to the super leads, they did it in a couple different ways. They'd have a bass circuit, and then they'd put a bright cap on it, and then they'd call it a super lead. But what happened in 1968 was magic, because what happened is that's when the split cathode amplifier came out, and that was the beginning of it all for the rock and roll sound, the bright Marshall sound, and the Brown sound. And I've done extensive research on his amplifier. I have different lists as to how it should be, and I've been extremely fortunate and extremely lucky in my time to meet one of Eddie Van Halen's first technicians, and we're very close friends, Rudy Liren, and he told me quite a bit about the amp and about how Eddie set it up and how he had his speakers in the room and what effects he used in front, how he used to drive it. It's just absolutely amazing. I met him when I was working with Brian Adams and Keith Scott on their gig. And anyways, it was absolutely mind-blowing. But yes, getting back to what you're talking about, my 12,000 series, it's what I consider a reproduction of what Eddie Van Halen would have used. There's a whole window. I mean, it's completely open for debate. There's forums out there, and there's guys that say he used this stage, he used that stage, these are the tubes that he used, this is the voltage that he ran the amp at. And it's neither correct nor incorrect. A lot of it, take it for what it's worth. But the one thing I know, 4 years ago, I did a reconstruction for a guy with a 12,000 series 68 Super Lead. And what happened is, of course, I variac that amp. And I brought it down to about 91, and that's where they said that Eddie brought it to. And then they said that he brought it down to 88 or maybe 86. And the truth of the matter with that is there's two things, okay? If you take the AC voltage down so low, the heaters will not work. And the thing is the heaters need to work because what happens is when you see the lights light up in your tubes, that's actually the heater filament. And the purpose of that is so that the heater filament heats up so that the cathode can warm up in the amplifier. And then what happens is the electrons go from the grid and then they cross through the cathode, they go to the plate, and then they return back to your controls, back through the circuit, and then they move on to the next stage. So the one thing is when you have your voltage too low with a variac, the amp won't work. So there is a certain specific voltage that it's going to work at. And you will achieve somewhat of the Brown sound due to the fact that what's happening is, on your first preamp tube, if you're supposed to get, say, 175 volts, if you drop your wall voltage in front of it by, 15 volts, you've dropped that tube down almost under 100 volts. So that's going to have a huge effect on how that amp is going to work, how it's going to sound, and how it's going to feel. Okay? So what happened is I basically took this 68 Super Lead that I was very grateful to restore for the customer. And then what I did is I started to use it as, very cleanly as a Frankenstein for measuring points with a variac. And what happened was I was fortunate enough to work with a great company in Chatsworth, California named Mercury Magnetics. And we came up with an actual power transformer that's got a virtual variac in it. So the projected B plus, which is that's the lifeline for the amp. What happened is I have a number in my head of where it needed to be, and we built that power transformer, and that's what I put in these amps. And if you go to YouTube and you do a search on either Tramble Plexi or you do Dr. Dan, Super Lead, you'll end up finding them. And the thing is, like I said, there's no right and no wrong sound for a 12,000 series. But the thing is I think I'm pretty close. So I'll kind of keep it at that.
Well, it's pretty cool, yeah, because I was talking to Howard Kaplan, who worked on the EVH series, and he was saying they sort of built in something in their circuit as well, sort of to lower the voltage, so you have that built-in brown sound that a lot of people don't know about. So some of that is incorporated, like in a different way, probably than how you do it.
Yeah.
But I think that's pretty awesome that you have a custom transformer. I mean, it's much better than going and getting a variac and trying to play around with it and then rebiasing your amp. And
100%.
I would.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. I was pretty lucky. I first started working with that company 6 years ago, and at that point, I mean, just like every home-based business, you have to start somewhere. And anyway, I'll never forget it. Patrick called me on the phone. He's like, "Dr. Dan, how you doing?" I said, "Oh, not too bad." And he goes, "This is Patrick Selfridge from Chatsworth, California." I said, "Oh my God, Mercury Magnetics. This is crazy." And anyway, but ever since then, we've had a really good relationship. I mean, they make good transformers. A lot of companies that make transformers make absolutely exceptional products. Haybauer is another one. Marstrand, which is a different a variation of Haybauer. And then we got a guy down in Southern California, Chris Marin. He makes really great transformers too. They're completely hand wound. He makes them himself. But I mean, it's but the thing is really honestly and truthfully, getting baselines like your operating voltages so that you can go down through the stages. That's one key to getting the amplifier set up absolutely to where you want it to be.
So do you have a preference for, say, what speakers would you use to go with that amp for like the early EVH sound out of like a Celestion? Which 100%. Would be the best choice?
Yeah, 100%. I like the medium magnet greenbacks, so the 25-watt greenbacks. But the thing is with a 100-watt amp, you need to run a couple cabinets with it. The other one that's pretty good too, and all speakers are good, okay? But the thing is you're just going to, when you start to get into the wormhole of speakers, you're going to get into something completely different. Because what's going to end up happening is say you have your amp set up one way, and then you're like, yeah, that's it. And then you're playing your guitar, and it sounds really great. The frequency response, the attack, the sound that's coming out of the speakers, it's all there. But the one thing I will say is with different speakers, what will end up happening is say if you run like a Marshall Plexi, you can't run the bass extremely high on them, okay? Because they bottom out. There's inherently a lot of low end in these amps. But say if you use a heavy magnet greenback, like a 30-watt, then what ends up happening is you can crank your mid-range a little bit more, and then you can start to bring your bass in a little bit more, and the actual speaker will start to sculpt and shape the sound in a different way. The best speaker that I have found for the EVH sound probably is the 25-watt greenback. They're great. They're really good. The 30 can be very good too. For the modern speakers, the one that I'll tell a lot of guys to go with, it's a very foolproof speaker. It can work with a multitude of different arrangements, is the Greenback 75 watts. And I stumbled upon that speaker 4 years ago when I went down to George Metropolis' shop, and I got to play through all his vintage Marshalls, every one of them. And I tried a lot of his older Pulsonic cabinets, and they were the holy grail of absolute Celestion tone. So when you listen to these albums, you're hearing Celestion Pulsonic cone speakers, which are unobtainable now. You can buy them on the secondhand market, but the problem with it is you just don't know what you're getting. So it's a real gamble. But these Greenback UK-made speakers are actually really good, and I've been putting them in a lot of cabinets. So
yeah, I've heard good things about them. There's a couple different models, isn't there? There's like a 65 and a 75.
Yeah. So how it works with those speakers is, because I get this question a lot with my customers, the 65-watt Greenback is modeled after a 25-watt Greenback, but it's more modern because it can handle more power. Okay. the efficiency on the speaker is still the same. I believe it's 96 decibels. Okay. And then when you get into the Creamback H75, what that is that's a modern rendition, UK made, of a 30 watt heavy magnet greenback. So that's basically what they're going after. And when you're talking, vintage Marshall tone, like I'm talking 4 input, like really honestly and truthfully, those are the only speakers, with all the people I've ever dealt with in my time of doing this. It's the number one choice.
So what about the EVH branded speakers? They're supposed to be like the G12H model, I guess.
What they are, now, if you're talking about the Celestian ones that came out a couple of years ago, what those are, there was a theory out there in the internet, and it's true. But I mean, the thing is from what I learned, he used a whole multitude of gear. And, and what happened was if he blew a couple pulsonic speakers, he's like, okay, what's cheap? What's available? What can we put in next? And that's how it went. And that was the exact same story with the Stamp too. He'd blow it up and then, okay, what's cheap? What's available? What'll get it working? Here we go. And let's roll with it. The Celestian Signature Series greenbacks, they're a fantastic speaker as well. And they were actually made right in I guess you consider it the custom shop in the UK, because at that point, there was only a handful of speakers that were being made in that custom shop, like the Alnico Blues and Golds and things like that, because they're higher end, much more expensive speakers. But yes, what they are renditions of are the 20 watt greenbacks, and the 20 watt greenbacks sound absolutely incredible. But I think supposedly what happened is when he used the 20s, I think he put a couple EVs in with them as well.
Yeah, in the early days.
Yeah, because those were a higher efficiency and they were a higher power handling. Because he had several dozens of cabinets, and he blew a lot of them up, and that's how he did it. He did it through experimentation, cutting up guitars, wiring stuff. That's how he did it.
So it's because you do everything yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, what are the wait times like? Say I wanted to order a 6812,000.
Yeah, it's probably right now. I get emails for them, and what happens is it's generally about 4 months. A lot of things changed 2 years ago with the pandemic. Pricing was one thing, and availability was another.
Yeah, everything's gone crazy. Like everything's like 50% to 100% more money for everything now. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I was talking to Dave the other day, and I actually, when we first started talking, I watched your video that you did with him. It was great, and he nails it right on the head. I mean, it's the availability of this stuff. Like maybe a little shorter than a year ago, we had this whole pandemic on tubes. It was nuts. People bought all these tubes like crazy, and the thing is they thought that they were going to go out of business because of unfortunately what's happening in the Ukraine right now. It's because of the tube factory that's it's in Russia. And so what happened is you're basically left with like one factory, because China shut down for the time. Shugong is shut down for the time being, and PS Main is open now. So people were they were completely terrified that they were going to run out of tubes. So anyways, we got that all straightened out, thank the Lord. But the thing is like manufactured materials like steel, I've noticed transformer companies have gone crazy with their prices lately. It's just everything's going up. But as a result, getting these products made and getting them delivered to you and stuff like that, it all takes time. And especially for me, being in Canada, being in the area that I'm at, I call it geographically challenged, okay? Because you have to get it sent to you, and it generally takes longer.
Yeah. And you have to pay duty on some things if you're getting it from the U.S. and
100%. And what I've found doing this business, once you find a really good company and someone really good to work with, you don't sway. You don't move to the next one. You stick with where you're at, and you just roll with the punches.
Yeah.
And generally, knock on wood, I've never had a problem. And I've got been really fortunate to work with some really awesome companies that are really helping me out. So it's that in itself is I look at myself 7 years ago, and I look at the first amp that I ever built, and then I look at them now, and it's an evolution, seeing them through the years. I'm finally starting to get them somewhere close to where I always dreamed of wanting them to be. But with my lead times, how it works is it's generally for a 12,000 series. It's about 4 months. What happens is the whole process with those amps, because they're my most expensive amp that I build, and they're completely custom. I use one brand of everything for the inside of the amp. I won't switch. So what happens is because I just will not jeopardize anything in that amplifier. But what I do is generally people email me through my website for them. We start to go through a rough idea for a quote. I always give roughly about a 5 to 15% window of swing with just the cost of materials and shipping and everything. And then once we figure that out, then we proceed. And because that amp is so custom, generally I only have so many parts on hand to build so many of them. So they can take me, sometimes about 4 to 5 months to build. And that's unfortunately, I'd like to have them quicker, but the thing is that's just that's the difficulty of the times that we're in right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great because I'm pretty interested in that app. We'll have to contact you and talk about that later.
No
But anyway,
problem.
I just want to say thanks, Dan, for taking the time.
Yeah,
And I found this really interesting. Just
awesome.
your take on all this stuff, and I'm sure other
Yeah,
people are really going to enjoy it. So I'll put a
yeah,
link to your website and your Facebook below this video on YouTube, so people will be able to find you easy.
yeah,
But I
no
just want to
problem.
say thanks again, Dan. Thanks for taking the
No
time.
problem, Greg. Thank you very much for having me. I sincerely appreciate it.
All right. Thanks again.
All right, take care.